So we're in our sermon series entitled Things Unseen, which is based upon one chapter of the Bible, Hebrews chapter 11. And we have now made our way through several outstanding, not perfect, but outstanding examples of faith. And now we come to our first post-flood patriarch, a man by the name of Abraham. I'm certain that all of you have heard of Abraham. Abraham is undoubtedly one of the most famous men to have ever lived. Abraham is the founder of the Israelites, and so all Jews are familiar with the name Abraham. In Christianity, we see Abraham as our spiritual forefather, so every Christian is familiar with the name Abraham. Even in Islam, Islam recognizes him as a prophetic figure. Now, what is it about Abraham that has put him on the map of history? Well, he was a man of faith, but his faith was foundational. He lived during a period of time when there was a lot of faithlessness, but he was a faithful man. And there's certain elements of his faith that are rather amazing that I want to unpack for us today so that we can apply them to our own faith lives. So we've come through the flood, Noah and his sons. The world is beginning to be repopulated. And of course, evil's back at it, and there's evil people and godless people all around. But God identifies a man in Mesopotamia who is a man of faith, and he comes to him and he gives him a command. And let's pick up on this in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10. There the word of God says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God." From this scriptural text, there are three uncomfortable aspects of faith that we are presented with. But each of them, as uncomfortable as they are to our flesh, brings incredible blessing to our lives as followers of the true and living God. And the first uncomfortable aspect of faith is this: that faith requires an immediate response. Delay and faith don't go hand in hand. Faith requires an immediate response. Abraham obeyed when he was called. And the Greek grammar of this particular statement means that he replied promptly. He replied promptly, immediately. He did not delay. He did not go around and poll his peers to see if they agreed with what God had said to him. He did not whine about it. He didn't dawdle. He didn't try to rationalize away this rather astonishing and uncomfortable command from God. He packed up his household and he left for the land of promise. That's a man of faith. Faith requires an immediate response. Now, what makes Abraham's faith especially astonishing is when we deeply consider his circumstances. So let's just take a few minutes to consider Abraham's circumstances. First of all, Abraham was responsible for hundreds and hundreds of souls. You might have an image of some poor Bedouin from ancient times with 3 or 4 people in his household and a half dozen sheep. But that's not the image of Abraham. Abraham, by modern standards, was a multi-millionaire. We know this because when he arrived in the land of Canaan, and at one point had to rescue his nephew Lot, who had been taken away into captivity, Abraham, just from his own little household, was able to put together, just from his tribe, just from his little clan, over 300 men who are of fighting age. So you could add to that all the men that weren't of fighting age, all the little boys that weren't of fighting age, and perhaps an equal quantity of women. So we're talking probably about a guy that was marching through the wilderness with maybe 12 or 1,300 people in his care. And in addition to that, hundreds and hundreds of livestock. So this is like a miniature city that Abraham is leading. He's essentially the mayor of a small town. And he marches out, and all these people follow him. Talk about a weight of responsibility. I'm sure he must have been thinking, I hope I got the message right. I hope I understood God. I hope that wasn't just the bad pizza I ate last night speaking to me. I hope I understood God correctly. So that's one thing for us to consider, which makes his response rather astonishing. But a second thing to consider is the distance he traveled. So we have to think there were no EVs. There were no internal combustion engines. Aircraft had not yet been invented. There were no bus systems. There were no paved roads. None of the modern conveniences that we experience in the modern world existed in Abraham's time. And the distance that he traveled was incredible. So if you follow his journey from his starting place in Ur to Haran, which is one of the destinations noted in his trip, that's by itself about 1,000 kilometers on foot, marching through deserts and wastelands and wildernesses. It's then another 700 kilometers from Haran to the heart of the Promised Land. So now we're up to a 1,700 kilometer trip. And then you'll know that he also went down to Egypt for a period of time, which is another 400 kilometers to go down to Egypt and back up. So this is an incredible journey that this ancient man in pre-modern times made without any guarantees, without any signed contracts from God, without any down payment of money, without any deed in his hand saying that he owned the Promised Land. The only thing that Abraham had as his guarantee was the character of God. That's all he had. The character of God. And that was enough for him to say, well, Lord, if you want me to go, I'm going to pack up my little town and I'm going to travel an incredible distance because you said so. That's why Abraham is a man of faith. That's faith. And the lesson for all of us to consider then is that when God calls us to do something, to say something, to forgive, to repent, to serve, to give, whatever it might be, whatever God calls us to do, our response must be like that. It must be obedient. God requires an immediate response when he issues a command. In fact, if we do not respond immediately, even if we eventually get around to it, that's not faith. Like, really? I mean, ultimately, if I get around to it at some point in time, don't I get cred with God? No, that's strategic planning. You can listen to the voice of God and then run the numbers, calculate the outcomes, have conversations with people, and get to a point where you feel humanly quite comfortable obeying God, but it's not faith. That's just strategic planning. It's because it makes sense to you. It's because you've hedged your bet. That's not faith. And I have a suspicion that many of us, sadly, have done that. We evaluate our faith based upon the outward expression, but really the only reason why we're living as Christians or we're obeying him in a particular area is because it makes sense. It's part of our strategic plan. So suppose God calls two people, for example, to do the same thing, to serve in a particular ministry, to offer a word of encouragement, to preach a sermon, to offer forgiveness, whatever it might be. The category could be broad. There's many things that mark our faith lives. But suppose God calls two people to do the exact same thing, and they both ultimately obey. But one obeys immediately. One obeys immediately. The second goes online and does some online research, asks about the salary or the reward or the benefit, weighs their options to see if it kind of works for them, thinks about it for a month or two, and then obeys. Both of them have ultimately done the same thing, but it's only the first person that has actually walked by faith. And yet, brothers and sisters, the second example is so common. This is how pastors often select churches. This is how missionaries often decide whether they're going to go and share their faith. This is how lay people often determine how and when and where and under what circumstances they're going to serve in their church or their community. They've weighed the options. It makes sense to them. And they think, well, ultimately I'm obeying, but that's not faith. That's strategic planning. Only the first kind of person can truly be ascribed faith. Now, that's not to say that there aren't times in our lives and God doesn't directly speak to us. And because he hasn't directly spoken to us, we have to weigh our options. We have to have conversations. We have to do strategic planning. I'm not opposed to strategic planning. God doesn't speak a word to us in every single decision that we make, but at times he does. At times, as we listen to God's Spirit in our lives and we read the Word of God, it's very clear, Lord, it's very clear to me right now, this is what you want me to do or say, or this is where you want me to go. It's very evident in our lives. And so my illustration serves to reinforce this point, that faith is obedience that is immediate, because that is the fullest, purest, humblest manifestation of trust in the Lord. Is that a characteristic of your life? Are you immediate in your response? You may be an obedient Christian, but are you immediately obedient? Immediately obedient. Immediate in your generosity. Immediate in your forgiveness. Immediate in your repentance. Immediate in your trust. Immediate in your service. Do you have like a hair trigger response? When God speaks, I do it. Or do you try to rationalize it away? By the way, I'll just say this. It's a whole lot easier to obey quickly. It's much easier to obey quickly. Because if you wait, temptation will start to come in. Fear will start to arise. Other people might try to lure you away. So you might think you're making your life easier or safer by delaying obedience, but it's not easier. It's stressful. It's fearful. It leads to increased temptation. And so when God asks us to do the seemingly impossible, our response should be, yes, sir, I'm going to get right at that. That's faith. And we learn that from Abraham's life. Which leads us to the second truth. Faith, this is uncomfortable as well, faith requires trust in the unknown. Faith requires trust in the unknown. The text tells us, and he went out not knowing where he was going. That's a little uncomfortable, especially when you're responsible for so many people. Now, all those places I previously mentioned, Haran, Canaan, Egypt, and all the places in between those that Abraham would have went through, you couldn't find those on a map in Abraham's day. Now, this is going to shock some of the younger people, but there was no such thing as GPS yet. How many of you remember the paper map days when you'd put the paper map on your steering wheel and almost get into car accidents trying to get from A to B? Okay, there wasn't even those yet. There was no GPS. There was no map. You couldn't go online and do some like real estate searches. I wonder what the price of land is like in Canaan. You couldn't do that. You couldn't go, post on social media. Hey, anybody been there? Can you tell me about it? What should I bring? What's the weather like? What are the resources like? Couldn't do that. The man literally was traveling blind. I mean, that's got to be uncomfortable. How many of you would just get in your car and just drive, hoping to arrive at some destination without a map, without GPS, just trusting the Lord's going to tell you when to turn left and when to turn right and when to stop? It's almost unimaginable. Now, some of you might have a great sense of direction. My father-in-law, Susie's dad, has an incredible sense of direction. He told me this story once. He took his daughter out to Bible college in Manitoba. And while he was there, he's like, you know what? I want to look up a friend of mine that I haven't seen for like 50 years. Didn't really even know what town this guy lived in. Certainly didn't have a street address. So he would just go sit in a coffee shop and strike up a conversation. Be like, hey, do you know such and such? Well, I might know such and such. And they'd give him a little bit of direction. And then he'd just go to another coffee shop and just kind of work his way around that area of Manitoba, and eventually found out where this guy lived, or where he worked rather, went to the job site, knocked on the job site trailer, and was reacquainted with his friend like 50 years later. Like, who does that? The guy's got an incredible sense of direction, which, by the way, don't tell her because she's in Texas right now and she's away at a conference. But to my shame, Susie's inherited that. So my wife is not a visual person. I'm not even sure if she knows what I look like, but she can beat me any day of the week getting to any destination. Like, it's uncanny. If she and I left this church at the same time in two different vehicles and we had to go to one of your houses, she would always be there before me. And I don't know how that's possible, but she's inherited that sense of direction. Suppose you have an incredible sense of direction. Okay, great. But it's not going to help you in this circumstance. Abraham might have had an incredible sense of direction. Maybe he could read the stars, the sun, whatever. Maybe he could ask friends along the way, hey, which way to Canaan? But this is still an incredibly uncomfortable set of circumstances for him. So no matter how great your sense of direction is, by the way, I know right well several women in the church have texted my wife telling her that I was just speaking about her in the service. You did, didn't you? Because it happens every time. Every time she's away and I mention her in the service, by the time I leave the service, there's messages on my phone, such and such text. So I know you texted her. Keep this between us. Okay? But let's suppose you have an incredible sense of direction. This is an issue of a different sort. What he did know is not the root, but he knew that he had a promise from God that God had and would provide for him an inheritance. Now, you should be making the connections now in your mind because you have an inheritance as well. You have a land of promise as well that you are headed toward as a member of the new covenant. And in that process, you may not know every turn in the road, but you know that God has promised you an ultimate destination. And so in our faith lives, it's not difficult to understand where this text is supposed to lead us. We must walk by faith. I mean, this sounds a lot like heaven. This sounds a lot like God's eternal plan. We don't even know exactly what heaven will be like. People sometimes say, what's heaven going to be like? Well, I kind of have a vague idea, but I don't really know any more than you do. I just know that there will be no more tears, no more crying, no more mourning. It will be beautiful. We'll be in the presence of God. It'll be like Eden 2.0 on steroids. But other than that, I don't really know much about heaven. But we know that God has something in store for those that love him and know him. Nor do we know when we're going to arrive. We don't know how long the journey's going to be. We don't know. It's going to happen, but we don't know how long the journey's going to be. But day by day, we get up, and our job is to walk by faith, assured that God has a land of promise waiting for us too. So let me put it to you this way. We do not need to know where we are going, so long as we know who we are going with. We do not need to know where we are going so long as we know who we are going with. It's not the road markers that are intended to grow our faith. It's the one who commands and who walks with us and who assures the ultimate destination. I know if you're a strategic planner like I tend to be, this can be a little uncomfortable because I like to know things before I do things. But we walk by faith. Abraham did not know where he was going, but he knew who he was going with, and we do too. And that's why we can walk by faith. The Christian cannot become pragmatic in their faith. Well, I follow Christ because I've discovered that it's easier. That's pragmatism. Well, I'm a Christian because I'm an intellectual and I've done the research and it checks all the boxes of my intellectual curiosity. That's pragmatism. Rather, it's a walk of faith founded on the God who has revealed himself to us in our salvation and walks with us every single day through our sanctification. Okay, but there's a third one, equally uncomfortable, and it is this, that faith requires willingness to wait. He went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents. Really? So you made this incredible journey, you got there, and you lived in a tent? God didn't even, in your lifetime, give you a mansion on a hilltop with a white picket fence around it? No. Abraham got to the land of promise, built an altar. The only piece of real estate he ever bought in Canaan was a little chunk of land to bury his wife Sarah. That's it. It would be generations before his descendants would take the land and cultivate it and dwell in it. So there's a delay here, not just a delay in terms of a long journey, but even when he gets there, God's like, okay, you're here now. And I've given you a foretaste of the ultimate promise. But now I'm going to sanctify your people and your descendants by making you wait hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before the land will fully be yours. So here we have a man who enters the land of promise after this incredible journey, and all he buys is a grave site. All he buys is a grave site. And his descendants would wait and wait and wait. So much for immediate results. Because you might have been thinking the way the sermon was going is, okay, so if I walk by faith and do all this uncomfortable stuff, then by 6:00 tonight, I'm going to have some results. But that's not how it works. We often have to wait for the results. We serve and we're like, okay, where's the fruit? And we have to wait for the results. We exercise trust in difficult times. We're like, okay, well, you're going to fix the problem now, right, Lord? I mean, I stepped up. I immediately responded. I'm going to make you wait a little while. God often does this in his plan to sanctify us and really to root out of us our sin and to develop deep-seated trust and humility in us. And that's because God's timing is not like our timing. God works on his own schedule for his own purposes. And the final destination, get this, really isn't even the main thing. So even for Abraham, the inheritance evidently wasn't even the main thing. The land of promise really wasn't even the main thing. Glorifying God was. Trusting God. Growing closer to God was. You do know that heaven is not the main thing, right? Heaven's not the main thing. Glorifying God, becoming more like Christ is the main thing. Ultimately, we will enter the eternal kingdom of God, but ultimately it's for the glory of God. And so God's not afraid to delay a little bit, to shake us up, to rattle our cages, to make us uncomfortable, to weed out of us impurity, and to build our faith. Far too many Christians quit early. Far too many quit early. Far too many want answers to their problems yesterday. Far too many want a roadmap delivered to their house yesterday. I want to know how this is all going to work. Far too many people want that relationship to be resolved now, or want that relationship now. Far too many want the cure to the disease now in order to continue to walk by faith. Far too many want the marriage fixed now, the prodigal son to return now. We want the outcome, but God is concerned about the process, because in the process, he is sanctifying us. He is purifying us. He is shaping us into the image of his eternal Son. And so our faith must be marked by patience. And yet so often we have the faith of a junior kindergarten student. I want recess now. I want my snack now. We just lack patience. We all do. Even as mature adults, we lack patience. And yet here Abraham, with the strength of the Lord, endured, and in the meantime flourished and matured. Again, he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. But he flourished and matured as he waited for God's full plan to be borne out generations later. And therefore, I think it's appropriate at this point for us to remind ourselves of this truth about faith. And that is that we walk by faith often to the benefit of future generations. How many of us think about that consistently? We walk by faith not just to the benefit of self, but we walk by faith to the benefit of our descendants, of those that will come after us, even if they don't remember us, even if they don't know our names. We walk by faith to the benefit of future generations. The full fruit of our faithfulness is often not seen for generations to come. I don't know how many of you have ever planted a tree. I've planted a lot of trees, like probably 600 or 700 trees. I have not planted as much as our resident forester, Paul Giroux. He's planted probably tens of thousands of trees. But I've planted a lot of trees on different properties I've owned. But I'll tell you this, as you get older, there's always this temptation to plant fast-growing trees because you start to run the numbers. You're like, why would I plant an oak tree when I'm in my 50s? Why would I plant a sugar maple when the things take like 30 plus years to mature and I'll never get to enjoy the maple syrup? Well, you might plant a few fast-growing trees like silver maples or whatnot, but tree planting is often for future generations. It's not for you. It's for future generations that will sit under their shade, that will eat of their fruit, that will collect the nuts that fall to the ground. Tree planting is often for future generations. It's not for us. If you want quick results, grow tomatoes, but don't plant trees. But our faithfulness blesses our children, and it blesses their children, and it blesses their children, and it blesses their children. And that makes faithfulness worthwhile. The results of our faithfulness may never be realized in our lifetimes. What motivated Abraham? Ultimately, he knew that the inheritance God promised was designed and built by God. They refer here to the city. You know, we get used to cities. We're kind of like, cities. Been to a lot of cities, lots of cities. Cities, whatever. There's lots of cities everywhere in the world. But in Abraham's day, a city was kind of a bit of a rarity. Most people did not live in cities. A city was like a technological wow. A city with walls and sewage systems and water systems and towers and houses. A city was a technological wonder. And God says to this nomadic man, Abraham, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations. The closest Abraham came to foundations was tent pegs. But he was looking forward to a city that had foundations, whose designer and whose builder is God. Again, the illustration may not have as much of a punch for those of us that have been to big cities as it would to Abraham, but this was like a wow factor for him. He was living in a tent for his entire life. His tents were secured to the ground with pegs. That's it. That's as permanent as it got for Abraham. But the city of God that God had promised him had foundations. And the immediate fulfillment of that would ultimately be Jerusalem, the city of God, and for us, through the new covenant eyes, the new Jerusalem. So we look forward to being with God, who is the architect and the builder of an inheritance, of a place that we will live for all of eternity. And if there's ever a city that must be awesome, it would be one that was sketched out by God and built by God. All cities have their issues. Some of them have issues accessing water. Some of them have issues with flooding. Some of them have issues with the lack of tree cover. Some of them have issues with shifting ground that cracks foundations. Some of them have issues with flooded basements because environmentalists never clean out the cricks with the fallen trees and the eagle nest living in them. Essex County. All cities have their issues, but this is a city whose architect is God and whose builder is God, and that sounds like a pretty awesome, safe, and secure city to live in. And one day we will. Do you believe that? One day we will. For Abraham's descendants, it would be Jerusalem, as I've already mentioned. For Abraham's spiritual descendants, it would be the new heavens and the new earth, the new Jerusalem. But either way, it is a place where God resides, and it is a place of blessing and security. So when we walk by faith, what we are actually doing, listen to this, is we are walking toward security, toward peace, toward God. And that's what makes faith a true blessing. We often think of it the other way around. When I walk by faith, I walk away from security. I walk away from comfort. But no, you're walking away from chaos. You're walking away from the unknown toward the known. This is what it means to walk by faith. Abraham's faith enabled him to travel to a land far away with no map, based on a promise to live in a tent while he awaited the city of God. And that's what we're waiting for as well. We walk by faith without a map, based on a promise, living in tents as we await the city of God. And his faith then must be ours as well. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but it's beautiful and it brings peace. So embrace the faith of Abraham.